Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Tennis Files podcast. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have Coach Justin Russ on this episode, on today's episode. And today we're going to talk about strength and conditioning, movement, and how to program your fitness workouts. And it's really exciting for me to have Justin. I've seen a lot of his videos on social media, and he's currently an assistant strength and conditioning coach at the University of Virginia. It just makes me think of when I interviewed Brian Boland a couple years ago, but just a very storied and great program, best of the best. And Justin has also worked with a lot of ATP and WTA pros, and I was actually checking out your stories from the WTA tour earlier today, Justin. But it's really great to have you on, and thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure coming on to podcasts such as these, and I know you've had an opportunity to sit down with some really elite companies. So thank you for reaching out, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, anytime. I was really impressed by a lot of the content that you've been sharing on social media, and it's kind of the power of those platforms where you get to just randomly see people who are demonstrating some really good value. So definitely happy to have you on. So, I just asked you this, before I hit the record button, but just generally, how is everything going in Charlottesville for you? Because I saw that you and the team have started working out again recently. So how's everything going?
Yeah, so I think first of all, it's just awesome to be back with my kids, and I call them my kids because I'm only a little bit older than them, but they're like family to me, and we have great relationships. And being apart was tough. It was like you don't really realize just how much you enjoy working with your athletes and how much they kind of pick you up on given days until you're without them for 5 to 6 months. But it's been great, but at the same time, it's been absolutely crazy. You go from this period of time when you're working from home, creating remote programming, maybe getting on, a bunch of Zoom calls and, creating training packets for your athletes for 5 to 6 months to now being right back into a full coaching schedule. And I think, I almost forgot how much energy coaching required and how taxing it could be. And with all the COVID protocols in place, and weight room capacity restrictions and conditioning capacity restrictions, you have a lot more training hours in a given day to accommodate the same roster sizes. But as busy as it is, it's awesome. It's year 2 with my players, so they know me, I know them, and it's just still building on what we've established last year. So it's been a lot of fun.
Awesome to hear that, Justin. And yeah, I was like I said, looking at your posts, and I saw some of your players saying, how much they missed training with you. So that's always obviously a great sign of the work that you're doing. I don't know if you can go more into depth into some of those restrictions, like the particulars of like the weight room and other restrictions that are placed upon at least UVA.
Yeah, first of all, I want to give a shout out to the sports medicine staff here. I think they've done a tremendous job of just keeping everybody safe and establishing just sound protocols that are based on the science and based on the research to come back in a really intelligent fashion. Basically, the way that it worked was, the high revenue generating sports came back first, kind of in the mid to late summer. So football and basketball have been back for quite some time. And then towards the end of summer, the fall sports returned. And so that was the volleyballs, that was the field hockey, soccer. And there were protocols in place to limit the number of athletes in the weight room. Masks should be worn at all times. Hand sanitizer on the way in, hand sanitizer on the way out. Obviously, thorough cleaning, no sharing of equipment at the beginning, and obviously practicing social distancing. And once it was demonstrated to where the athletes could adhere to those protocols in a professional way, capacities were expanded and more flexibility was provided in terms of the sharing of equipment. And then once classes began a couple of weeks ago, that's when the rest of the student athletes returned. So that's when I was able to start working with tennis, obviously being a spring sport.
Awesome. Yeah. Shout out to Sports Med. I remember when I was an athlete, and got injuries. Like they were so helpful. But yeah, it's really important, obviously, to have these safety protocols in place. It's a crazy time. And I was just curious about the masks because I help run. I'm the VP of a county tennis association, obviously in my county, and so we run the USTA leagues, and we've been kind of thinking about, like, obviously the masks and whatnot. But has it been difficult for the athletes in terms of things like recovery and breathing to wear a mask during play, and also, like, are there specific masks that are better to use as an athlete than others?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think with it being the first experience to training with a mask on for an athlete, there's obviously a curve of discomfort that takes place there, right? And it's like a wow, holy crap! Like this is the first time I've ever lifted weights in a mask, and this is the first time I've ever done conditioning type stuff in a mask. And I think it's just important, really, that I kind of, as the coach and as the leadership figure in the room, really kind of set the tone and establish my own example with it, and acknowledge, like, hey, look, this might not be ideal, but this is what's at stake. And if we want to compete this year, then we have to stick to these protocols. And I know that, if people in positions of leadership, such as myself, administration, coaches, sports medicine, continue to set the tone and continue to stay on these kids, because it's not comfortable at the end of the day. But everybody wants to compete, and it's important to keep the bigger picture in mind. And as far as the question about masks being better than the others, I just encourage my athletes to wear whatever mask they feel the most comfortable in. So if that's the neck gaiter style, if that's the surgical style mask, I prefer the simple surgical style masks personally myself. I think they're a little bit lighter and easier to breathe, but if you have to wear a face covering, I would just tell my athletes to wear whatever comfortable for them.
Nice. I think you got to make a few, put your face on them. I think that'll be kind of fun. But yeah, just an idea. But good stuff there. And I'm always interested in the paths of people who have become experts in their field. And so I want to kind of start with your path, after these intro questions, of course, and ask you how you or what inspired you to become a strength and conditioning coach.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and that's one that comes up in a lot of these podcast interviews that I do. And honestly, I played sports growing up. I grew up playing football and lacrosse in upstate New York, and I think you get to that point when you're in school, and it's your parents and society and the education system kind of pushing you and nudging you to say, hey, look, it's time to figure out what you're going to do with your life. And I think it was my junior year of high school when a teammate of mine on the football team, went up to me in the weight room and said, hey, look, you'd be a great trainer someday. And, up until that point, I never thought about it. I didn't know that you could study exercise science in college and major in it. But once I figured that out, I was all in with it. I'm like, I want to get into this industry. I want to work with athletes. I don't want to have to get dressed up every day to go to an office and sit behind a computer, because I'm just not that kind of person. And it just went from there. When I got into undergrad, I studied exercise science, and it's just been a lot of right people, right places, right timing, and a lot of luck to end up now at UVA and had some of the previous experiences that I've had.
Yeah, you have had some great experiences. I mean, with IMG, I saw a couple of videos of you on YouTube coaching at the Multidirectional Academy. Like I said, work with some great pro players. So, you talked about other sports that you were playing when you were growing up, tackling people and so forth. But what or how were you exposed to the tennis side of strength and conditioning?
Yeah, that's funny. I'll back up for just a second. I didn't realize that those videos from Mortaglu were up on YouTube.
Yeah, there you go.
That was actually, and that was that's funny. That's news to me. That was actually when I was interviewing there, prior to getting started with my second stint on the WTA tour. That's funny. How did I get involved with tennis? This is another kind of one of those things where it's just right people, right places, right timing, and just kind of tennis found me essentially. While I was working at IMG, I was assisting across the board with multiple different sports. So I was assisting on tennis, assisting on golf and soccer, football, basketball. And what had happened was we had two strength coaches leave within like a week of one another. So we had our head person for lacrosse leave, and we had our head person for tennis also move on. And I was pumped because the head person in charge of lacrosse left. And now I kind of slid into that because I was assisting him with it. And this was my sport growing up. I'm like, finally, I can make lacrosse my baby. And this is my sport, But at the same time, it was like this big purple elephant in the room in the office. Everybody was kind of looking at each other like, okay, well, who is going to take this beast that is tennis? Right? It's the biggest sport at IMG. It's obviously the one that has a lot of eyes on it. And you know what? I just said, it's my time to step up, and I'm going to start writing the programming for this next semester. And I started programming for the entire lacrosse program and the entire tennis program for a semester at IMG. And by the end of that time, the administration there decided that they enjoyed the work that I did with tennis. The feedback was good, and the players bought in. I really enjoyed it. I liked working with a different kind of athlete. I thought that it evolved my coaching quite a bit. And IMG basically said, hey, look, you can be the head person for lacrosse or tennis, but you can't do both. So I had a great conversation with my friend Vinny, and we kind of talked about how tennis was more of a global sport, and I have the opportunity to work with professional athletes, have an opportunity to travel, which I love to do. And I wanted to, continue to learn about this sport that isn't such a mainstream sport for American strength coaches. And where better to do that than IMG? And that's how I fell into it.
Good choice. I'm glad you picked tennis. Obviously,
it's been one of my better decisions. Yeah.
Yeah, same here. So as far as your change in sports focus, I'm interested to find out from you, because I like to compare sports and pick what's useful and what's not. What are some maybe different aspects, or how did you program tennis players differently from other sports?
I think that's just been a learning process, to be honest with you. I think at the beginning, I stuck to the basics, which I still do, but I stuck to what I know, and I stuck to the simple things and things that I knew that would work. And I think as I've evolved and grown as a coach with tennis, and been around people like Mark Kovacs, and been around people like Robbie Ohashi, who works with Kei Nishikori, and been around people like Glenn Weiner, and the coaches I'm with right now, Andres Pedroso. The more I've learned about the intricacies that exist in tennis in terms of playing style, in terms of foot positions, in terms of movement skills on the court, in terms of strategy and tactics, I think that those things have definitely played a role in the evolution of my programming, both in the weight room and on the court, and in terms of conditioning. So I would say that, simply put, at the beginning, it was quite general and quite broad. But over the span of time and having the opportunity to learn from so many great people in the tennis world, I've been able to, develop and continue to develop a program that I think has been quite good to help tennis athletes play and perform better on the court.
Got it. Awesome, Justin. Yeah, and you mentioned Dr. Mark Kovacs. He's a legend, and now he's with the Cleveland Cavaliers, which is sick, as their director of sports science, I think. And you and I have one thing in common, although I think you're at a higher level than I am, but we're both certified by the International Tennis Performance Association, which Dr. Mark Kovacs and his wife Mary Jo head. So great organization there. As far as your certifications, I was curious, there are a lot of coaches also listening. What are maybe the top 2 or 3 certifications or knowledge from these particular organizations that you end up using the most on a daily basis? So in other words, like maybe what are the best ones that maybe coaches or other people are interested in learning about the tennis fitness side of things? Like which ones are the best ones?
Yeah, so in terms of tennis fitness and being very particular to tennis, I think that doing the certified tennis performance specialist through the ITPA was a game changer for me. And it was cool because Mark actually came down to IMG Academy to kind of lead us through that live and practical portion of that certification. So it was really, really insightful for me and really impactful for me to be able to get on court with Mark and go through, some tennis specific footwork, some movement patterns, some stances, look at positioning for the forehand and the backhand, look at positioning for the serve, and really just dive into it and have him there and be able to kind of bounce ideas around off him. So I think for any coaches that are working with tennis athletes that are listening, I would highly recommend the International Tennis Performance Association, CTPS, for sure. I'm really looking forward to taking the functional range conditioning course. I just signed up for functional range conditioning. I'm going to take that in November. But to be honest with you, I think it's not necessarily about the certifications that one possesses. There's so much great research and great information out there on the internet that you can find, just peer-reviewed articles and books and literature on strength and conditioning and on program design and so many topics in this field that I would almost encourage up and coming prospective coaches to look into the research and look into the literature as opposed to necessarily going all in on certifications.
I like it. Yeah, great advice for all you aspiring fitness coaches out there, or really any coaches actually. So I want to shift some to strength training. It's a favorite of mine. I remember when I went to law school, I stopped playing tennis, but I still ended up, lifting a ton and trying to learn about that. So, and this is sometimes when I ask this question, some of the coaches, they kind of, shake their head or whatnot. I mean, it's not a crazy question, but it's kind of tough, I guess. But what are some of the most important basic strength training exercises that, if somebody came up to you and said, oh, hey, I'm a 4-0 tennis player and I feel like I need to increase my strength, like what are, a few basic exercises that you would recommend that they integrate into their workout routine to get, to increase their strength?
Yeah, I think going back to the previous point, I like to keep things really simple. And I think it just makes for a better experience for the athlete, and it just allows for a greater understanding of kind of what they're doing too. So I think when you look at, what are the 7 foundational movements that every athlete should be competent in? Can they squat? Can they hinge? Can they lunge? Can they push? Can they pull? Can they rotate? Can they plank? So I think if you look at those 7 foundational movements, you can then, categorize hundreds of different exercises based upon those. But it all comes back to being competent in those 7 foundational movements.
Got it. And which of these 7 movements would you say that you found that your athletes kind of are lacking in the most and don't really, like they forget to just focus on that area?
Oh, it's tough. I would say that athletes in general and tennis athletes in particular, I think, need to pay particular attention to the posterior chain in general. So looking at the posterior chain, looking at the hinge patterns, pulling, right? I think that tennis being such a quad dominant sport with the amount of decelerations and the amount of changes of directions that take place, oftentimes I think the posterior chain can be a little bit underdeveloped. And let's be honest, the posterior chain is not always the most fun or maybe feels the best to train. Additionally, when you look at the upper extremity, tennis posture is a real thing. You have the often elevated traps, the protraction and internally rotated shoulders. So it's important to kind of help pull them out of that posture. And again, that goes back to focusing on the posterior chain, so the backside of the body.
Gotcha. So I was wondering if maybe you could give us like one exercise for each one of those 7 domains? I mean, obviously, we've got the squat there. Okay, I'll actually back up. First off, with the squat, is there a particular variation that you prefer? I saw you doing a front squat on one of your recent posts. Like, is there one that you think is better suited for tennis athletes?
Yeah, so another kind of little crusade mentally that I've been on lately is tailor the program to the athlete, not the athlete to the program.
Mm.
And what I've really tried to do lately with myself is just be less dogmatic. And although I have something written on a piece of paper, I have to take into consideration the athlete's needs, the athlete's movement abilities, the athlete's injury history, and so on and so forth. I need to be able to tailor the program to the athlete and put them in an environment and set them up for success, yet still be able to stick to the philosophy of my program and stick to what I'm trying to accomplish in terms of goals. So going back to the question about squats, I think when I started with tennis players up until relatively recently, I would have answered that question. Yes, front squats are the best thing for tennis players. Now I'm kind of like, well, the front squat really doesn't put every athlete in the greatest position to succeed. So why am I having them do that if other athletes might be more comfortable squatting with 2 kettlebells or squatting with a safety squat bar, or back squatting? So I've started to, make some observations with some of my athletes and just recognizing those that might benefit from making adjustments with their squats, to having them use the safety bar, having them, use dual kettlebell, or maybe having them stick to the front squat just based on how they move. So everything has to take context into consideration. And again, if I kind of go back to my philosophy of tailor the program to the athlete, not the athlete to the program, I need to look at the context of how does this athlete move? What is their positioning like? What is their injury history like? And what variation of this foundational movement is going to suit them the best and set them up for success, yet still accomplish the goal?
Got it. So maybe if maybe they underdeveloped in their quads, you might choose like a certain variation of the squat or something like that, basically to tailor to them.
Yeah, I look at movement patterns more than anything. If I find that a front squat is just uncomfortable in terms of the rack position, whether it be crossing their arms or if the athlete can't achieve this, maybe I'll have them move to the safety bar. Or if I find that an athlete is leaning too far forward up through the torso in a front squat or a back squat, again, maybe that might be a safety bar variation. Or if I'm really trying to limit axial loading with somebody, maybe I'll have them stick with the front squat and maybe have them use the wraps or whatever position is comfortable for them. Or it just depends on how the athlete moves and what's comfortable for them.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So appreciate that. It's really important to, I guess that's part of why it's important to not just like simply look at one program that some athlete's doing and then assume that it'll just work for you. There's more optimal programs out there, and we've got to consult people, like Justin, obviously, to make sure that we're programming to the best of, our current capabilities and so forth.
100%. There's not a one size fits all approach, and that's one thing that I wish more coaches knew, especially those that dealt with tennis players. It's like we're fortunate at the college level to deal with small roster sizes, and with that in mind, I can have a great opportunity to get to know my athletes as people, but get to know the way that they move and kind of their tendencies in the weight room and also their preferences. And with that being said, having that small roster size makes it really easy for me to create more individualized programs for them.
Yeah. Actually, I was wondering, another question I was going to ask you, as far as like, I guess when you were at IMG, how difficult was it? Like, were you able to create, did you create like one base program and then you just made like certain, adjustments based on the athlete? Like, how did that work out with a lot of kids over there, I assume?
Yeah, so IMG was difficult to individualize because we got to remember IMG is a high school.
Yeah.
So you have a lot more athletes and you have some variance in ages, right? So IMG, I was working with kids that were 14 to 17, 18 years old, and there were maybe 25 to 30 of them in a session, and maybe myself and maybe two other coaches. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's athletes that are still growing into their bodies, athletes that may not possess proper foundational movement competency, athletes that might not, have a great deal of training experience or high training age, and athletes that might not possess a great deal of emotional maturity. So I think for the certain level of high school aged athletes at IMG Academy, it was pretty generalized. Now, as the level of tennis athlete rose, so as I started to work with the ITF junior level players and the ranked junior level players and the pros, then things started to become much more individualized because I was dealing with athletes at a higher level. The groups were smaller, and these athletes typically, had a certain level of professionalism not found in the high school and the more casual players.
Got it, Justin. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense there. And so kind of back to those 7 domains, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind giving us like, one or two just like common, exercises. Obviously, like we talked about, it may not be the best for you, but just kind of to give them an idea of like what exactly, for example, is a hinge movement and so forth, like if you don't mind doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start at the top. So start with a plank, but taking the plank and turning it into a total body exercise. And, rather than just sitting there for a minute, 2 minutes and holding it as long as you can, let's take the plank and literally try to engage the entire kinetic chain. So squeezing the quads, squeezing the glutes, engaging the core, kind of locking the shoulder blades in place and thinking about ripping the ground apart with your hands. That'll light up everything. It'll completely change the movement. You can also, take that same concept and work in the frontal plane and do the side plank the same way. So then we take the pull, for example. So when we look at pulls and pushes, we're looking at two directions of movement. We can look at a horizontal pull, like a row or a TRX row. A vertical pull, like something like a pull up or a pull down. Push, that would be something like a chest press or a dumbbell press. Vertical push would be like a dumbbell press here. Lunging. The thing to know with lunging would be, hey, look, we can lunge in multiple planes of movement, and it's important that both hips contribute to that movement. And I want to get some bend on that back leg. But lunging is extremely crucial for tennis athletes. When you look at the sport, there are so many different, tennis shapes, and a lot of them involve a lunge. But it's an extremely versatile movement that can be done in all planes of movement: forward, lateral, backward, diagonal. A hinge pattern, what we're thinking about is movement through the hips with minimal movement at the knee. So if I think about it, if I'm standing up, I want to think about almost pushing my hips back towards the wall with my torso over top of the ground. My knee is still going to stay on top of my ankle. And what that's going to look like, it's going to look like a straight leg deadlift. Now, the difference between a hinge and a squat is the squat is going to get more of that knee bend along with that hip movement. My ankle has to be able to move too, so that my knee is going to shift onto the over top of the ball of my foot and onto my midfoot. So that's going to be a more knee dominant movement. Rotation, obviously, is extremely important for tennis athletes. And we can look at rotation in a couple different ways. We can look at maintaining my shoulder and hip relationship and almost like turning on a skewer. But then we can look at the dissociation of my shoulders and hips and how well I can dissociate that. That's going to make my shots that much more efficient. And if I can dissociate the upper and lower extremity better, that's going to allow me to produce more force.
Got it.
I hope I covered that.
Yeah,
you got me into coach mode. You got me into coach mode there. I flicked the switch.
excellent. That's a goal. No, I really appreciate that. Like I said, it's helpful for people to, I guess, be able to visualize the concept. So that was awesome. As far as you posted recently on Instagram that you had to make some adjustments, obviously, not being able to get to a gym. And so you said that, having limited access to equipment forced you to get more creative with your workouts. So I was just curious, I know people are still obviously working out from home. So what type of adjustments did you make in your workout? Maybe what you used to do and then what you changed, when you had to work out at home. That would be kind of interesting to hear about.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. That was definitely one of the silver linings of the quarantine and the lockdown in the summer that I would say is, I went from somebody that would get to the weight room probably 4 or 5 times a week and strength train. That was my primary means of fitness. I think once the quarantine happened, I was completely thrown off. I'm like, okay, I need to figure something out, to do for my exercise. And one of my goals that was kind of floating in the back of my head was like, I want to get really fit to prove to my players that I'm as fit or more fit than they are. And I'm going to show them this when it comes to conditioning time, and maybe I'll jump in, or sometimes we play team ultimate football. And, aside from that, I just wanted to get myself fit so that I can serve my athletes better. And I can continue to bring a certain degree of energy onto the court in the weight room, because that's what I love. Is I'm a very high energy coach. But what I decided to do was I actually snuck into one of our facilities, don't tell anybody, and I grabbed a kettlebell, and I grabbed just some 6-inch mini hurdles, and I have a TRX, and I love the TRX equipment. And what I did was I found just this open field on grounds here at UVA. And again, it started off really simple. It just started off with some basic kettlebell movements and some running, and it turned into just circuit training and experimenting more with the kettlebell and doing different types of running, whether it be long, slow distance and more steady state oxidative work to sprint work. There's a set of stairs that's pretty steep on grounds that we started running, followed by some laps around the soccer field. And it was really cool. The tennis coaching staff joined me. So it was just a really cool experience. We got into a good routine of doing circuits with the kettlebells, mixing up the running, whether it be slower paced or more sprint work. The stairs was a great change of pace. So it was a really cool silver lining to the quarantine.
Yeah, it's amazing. Really cool that you did that, and had people involved too. With that, I'm wondering, with not being able to get on the heavy weights, is there still a way to like maintain or reduce as much as possible, like strength loss? Like, what I'm wondering, I guess, I guess that's the question really, is like, what can you do like with body weight and other ways so that when you get back on the weights, you haven't lost that much strength?
Yeah. I think that, the biggest thing is just to stay on top of it and stay consistent with your training. And, at the end of the day, if you are somebody that has a high degree of strength and fitness initially, even if you go through a period of time like we just did, and you can't strength train as much as you used to, it's going to come back if you maintain that high level of fitness. So one of the things one of the challenges I was faced with when it came to developing some of the distance-based programming for my athletes here was, okay, how am I going to still address the demands of the sport, having access to, I visualized, like, what can I do in my living room? So a lot of the ways a lot of the strategies that I utilized in my programming were continuing to program explosive and dynamic exercises like jumps and different variations of jumping and landing. Another strategy that I like to utilize a lot was just using tempo and slowing the movements down and creating time under tension and creating that eccentric loading, even though the athlete's not going to have external load, that eccentric loading is going to still produce enough of a stimulus. Utilizing isometrics. Isometric, an example would be like a wall sit. Everybody's knows. But still trying to stress the tissue, utilizing items like tempo, like time under tension, explosive dynamic movements. And then from a conditioning standpoint, still addressing all facets of energy system development, right? Can I produce speed? So higher intensities at lower volumes. And then how can I still work on that oxidative system as well and go maybe at a lesser intensity, but over the longer span of time? So I try to attack kind of all that with some of the distance programming for my athletes.
Awesome, Justin. And, kind of speaking about equipment, are there like what pieces of equipment would you say, I guess let's go back to the average like USC player, 3.0 to 5.0. What pieces of equipment would you recommend that they, get for themselves to maximize their efficiency and effectiveness of their workouts, especially if they're doing them at home?
That's a good question, and I'm a little bit biased. I've been with TRX training for almost 9 years now in their education department, and TRX has been a huge part of my life in terms of the way that I train myself and also the way that I just coach and communicate. But it's such a versatile piece of equipment. I literally use the TRX at my house, in the park, on a random sign around grounds, anywhere that I could go during the quarantine. So it's extremely versatile, and there's a ton of different things that you could do with it. So I would definitely recommend a TRX. And then I'm trying to think, okay, if I'm recommending this to tennis athletes and a tennis audience, the first thing that comes to mind is like, okay, what can fit inside of a tennis bag? So invest in some good mini bands and do some glute activation stuff daily. Invest in some super bands that are a range of weights, and invest in a kettlebell and maybe a medicine ball. You'd be amazed at how much you can get done with a kettlebell, a medicine ball, some bands, and a TRX.
Amazing. And then as far as the kettlebells, what's I know it varies obviously, but like what's your advice for choosing like the proper weight, and also like how many weights would you get, probably like what range?
I think generally speaking, I would recommend people to kind of undershoot it. You don't want to get something that's too heavy. But if it's me, if it's buying it for myself, I would probably get a 16 kilogram and a 20 kilogram. Kettlebells typically come in kilograms. Just do the conversions of pounds multiplied by 2.2. Mm-hmm. But it just depends on the player, and it depends on the strength level. But I would undershoot rather than try to go too heavy, because again, movement quality is of utmost importance, and there's ways that you can still stress the tissue without load.
Good stuff. And actually, going back to TRX, could you explain a little bit more? Obviously, you can, you're an expert in it, but can you tell us a little bit more about TRX? Like, what exactly is it, and the type of movements that you're doing on that?
Yeah, so I'm going to take this straight out of the script. So TRX was developed by a guy named Randy Hetrick, who was in the Navy SEALs for a number of different years, and basically Randy was on a deployment on a mission overseas in East Africa or something, and the mission kept getting delayed. And what he decided to do was take some parachute webbing and an old karate belt and stitch the two together so that him and his teammates could perform pushing and pulling exercises with no access to equipment and in this like military bunker while they're waiting to go and do the thing. So it's a extremely versatile tool that's going to allow a user to utilize their body weight and gravity to perform an endless amount of exercises. But the biggest thing is that it's scalable. And you can tailor the intensity down for somebody that's a complete beginner and also somebody that's a veteran and has a high degree of experience. And that's what I like so much about it is it does a great job of placing people in positions to succeed and also understand just how to move better and what movement quality is. And then you can pick up intensity from there. But obviously, going back to posterior chain, it's going to be great for pulling. It's going to be great for learning how to squat better. Mm-hmm. It's a phenomenal core training tool. So planks and body saws, hamstring curls and hip extensions. And yeah, it's something I use daily with my players. And it was something I used daily during the quarantine.
Awesome stuff, Justin. Appreciate that. And so kind of shifting a bit to movement, I was wondering about your approach to improving people's movement. I mean, do you start with like drills? Do you look at their movement and like the way their legs and feet move and all that? Like what's the approach? Like if we know that we have some deficiencies, like how should we approach improving our movement?
Yeah, so I was actually talking to Lee Tapp, the speed coach, about this a couple of weeks ago on his podcast too. And, going back to what I was saying about just people that have been really influential in my growth as a coach, Robbie Ohashi is Kei Nishikori's fitness coach, and he's a phenomenal guy. Just great coach, but an even better dude. He did such a great job of articulating his thoughts on a movement philosophy. And I've kind of adopted that same kind of thought process. And what he does is when he looks at his movement sessions, he'll categorize his on-court movement sessions into linear days, lateral days or something across the baseline, and multidirectional days working through the angles. Mm. And I really like that because, that provides a very simple template. And, the other philosophy that I really like kind of comes from Kovacs. And Mark always said, hey, look, every time you step onto the court to run a session, make sure it has a theme, make sure it has a purpose. So kind of taking those two and meshing them together, it's like, okay, what's my theme or my purpose for the day? Is it linear? Is it lateral? Or is it multi-directional? But to go back to your question, I think you can tell a lot about how an athlete moves by looking at how they move in a very controlled environment, like a dynamic warm-up. I can look at my athletes and be like, okay, well, this person's got some issues here and this person might need some work there. You can also tell a lot about how they move just by watching them in the weight room as well. So I think just being an observant coach and paying attention to how your players move can provide some great insight into, what you're going to need from a programming standpoint. And, and in terms of coaching movement, in terms of improving my players' movement, I believe that really, again, quality over quantity. And I think that people need to learn how to stop before we get into too much crazy drills. Look, at the end of the day, tennis involves a ton of changes of direction. And I think when I watch even tennis at the highest level, I see just a lacking of body control when it comes to putting on the brakes in both a forward and a lateral direction. So I think it's absolutely crucial to coach deceleration before we get into overly specific work and, really kind of complex drills.
Good stuff there. And so as far as deceleration, what types of things do you do to actually coach that? Are there specific exercises or movements or like what exactly do you have your athletes do to train that part of their movement?
Yeah, so I just posted a video today actually of just some things that I filmed for a player, and I'm like, these look pretty good. I'm gonna post these on the gram. But it's something I like to call ground attacks, but basically starting from an upright tall position and snapping down as fast as I can to teach the loading of an athletic position. And I can do that bilaterally on 2 feet. And I can come down onto 1 foot as well. And I think that does a great job of teaching my athletes how to control deceleration and how to absorb force. I love doing low-grade plyometrics utilizing the mini hurdles and teaching the athlete how to load the back hip extend and explode up, and then stick the landing and use that hip to again absorb force. But then when it comes to the actual movement component of it and the movement portion of it, again, it's sticking to simple, right? An example would be, okay, if I have a group of athletes lined up on the baseline, I can have them split step, which we're all familiar with. I can have, a cone, maybe a foot in front of the service line. They're going to explode forward out of that split step and maybe stick in an athletic position and put on the brakes in a split stance or a launch. But I'm basically teaching them, hey, look, I want you to minimize your time spent on the ground after that split step. I want you to explode forward and then bam, put on the brakes either in a base or athletic position or load it onto that one leg. But I've kind of progressed them to be able to do that with the preceding movements or preceding drills.
Very nice, Justin. As far as, you mentioned these different, like Nishikori's movement coach or fitness coach, you mentioned these linear days, the lateral days, I think, and multidirectional days. So do you train those equally, or is that another case of I look at Kay or I look at whoever and I see like which areas do they need more work on, and then I'll emphasize that part more?
Yeah. I tend to spend probably more time looking at lateral and multidirectional work.
Yeah.
I with such a small percentage of the sport being existing linear, I would rather not dedicate an entire session to that. So I've started to treat the linear portion as kind of my preparatory work prior to getting into lateral and multidirectional work. So I would say that I spend more time there. And if I have an opportunity to maybe have a small group of athletes or an individual session, then it's kind of a conversation with them and the coach in terms of, okay, what is this person's playing style? What areas of improvement do they need to make within their on-court movement? And then it's coming up with a plan of attack from there.
Got it, Justin. And so kind of a similar question, but when we talk about just training overall, I was wondering, again, like, do you train all of the different aspects, like, strength and agility and, maybe power and maybe even hypertrophy? Like, do you train all those during like all those at the same time, or, like all of them in a given week, or do you like train a couple of them, for like a couple months and then you shift to different aspects? Like, yeah, I guess that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, so the program as a whole progresses, and I need to be mindful of, really ultimately where my athletes are in terms of the season and where they're at in the calendar. For example, I sat down and I knew that I would have 10 weeks with my players before they left for Thanksgiving break. But, to kind of summarize, I try to attack all those skills concurrently. If you look at my weight room program right now, we have exercises programmed for power. We have exercises programmed for strength. We have exercises programmed for dynamic and explosiveness. But then there are some more drills done for, high repetition, muscular endurance and tissue tolerance, because, this is the time to continue to build the base. If you look at what we're doing from a movement standpoint, again, we're trying to attack both ends of the energy system spectrum, but we're also looking at lateral and multidirectional speed. And then you got to factor in a recovery day as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. As far as your recovery days, how do you treat recovery? Like, are you giving them, I don't know, like, 1 day off, 2 day off? Like, what's your approach to that in general? Good stuff. And kind of again, like a exercise specific question. I was wondering of your views on, everybody loves to do the bench press and then go to the beach, but what is your take on the bench press? Can that be a useful movement? Is it a useful movement for tennis players in terms of developing some sort of movement or strength or whatever for the tennis for their tennis matches?
Yeah, again, so it's all about context, right? And I think, when I was a younger coach, I probably would have been like, yeah, the bench press has no place in tennis because it's such a stable and supported environment with, 5 points of contact, right? It's a fixed barbell, right? It's not quote unquote functional, if you will, right? But that stable environment and that fixed barbell might be exactly what some athletes need to develop basic foundational strength. So it depends on context. Now, personally, I don't have any bench pressing, programmed into my athletes' programs at the moment. My athletes were pressing with dumbbells, and we do some landmine presses and more angled and vertical presses because I think that's more applicable to the sport. But again, depending on the context and depending on the age and depending on all these other factors, the bench press could be a great option for the people that you're dealing with.
Gotcha, Justin. So, again, this it's kind of a tough question. Like, I'm wondering for those players, let's go back to the USCA players. They're 4.045, 3.5, whatever, and they don't really work out. They're playing tennis and that's their only exercise, and they enjoy it and whatever. But then all of a sudden, their mind clicks, whether they're listening to this podcast episode or they see something, feature about training and how much it can help you perform on the court and increase your longevity on the court for years to come. What advice do you have for them as far as, these untrained, basically players, they just play tennis? Like, what would you tell them to do in terms of you should do XYZ, or you should train this way, or you should do these exercises? Like, what would you say?
Yeah, two things come to mind right away. Number one, keep it simple. Master the basics. It's not the stuff that's necessarily sexy. It's not the stuff that's going to get a ton of Instagram likes and get reposted. But master those 7 foundational movements: the plank, push, pull, hinge, squat, lunge, and rotate. And do those things well. And the other thing is, and this is a very unpopular sentiment in the tennis community, is play multiple sports, especially for the young kids out there. Is play multiple sports. The developments of a broad toolbox and a broad motor skill set is completely invaluable for younger athletes and developing athletes. And I think it'll go such a long way. So those are the two things that I would say: is keep it simple, master the basic foundational movements, and look into playing in other sports.
Yeah, beautiful stuff. Have you read the book Range by David Epstein?
I have not.
It's a good one. So it essentially it talks about what you just mentioned. That it's cool because the very first chapter, not to ruin the whole book or anything, but it starts with how a lot of people have looked at Tiger Woods' path and how he just played golf at a young age and that's all he did. And so they've tried to emulate that when in fact it's somebody like Roger Federer, who has played multiple sports, who is the one that you should be emulating. And then they go into obviously other fields, and a lot of people who you think were specialists, they actually became so great at something because they had all this knowledge that they accrued from different sports, different experiences, etc., that they use. And a lot of times we need those people, they're more helpful and they can transfer their skills better onto different domains than somebody who's been locked in one particular area. So it's a really cool book. I'll tag it in the show notes. But yeah, I definitely agree with that for sure. Yeah.
That sounds awesome. I'm gonna have to check that out. But it's I mean, I could talk about this stuff all day, and I think the tennis world is just so unique with parents and kids and wanting to go professional and wanting to play in college, and coaches that obviously want to make a living for themselves. And you have coaches telling athletes that they're going to be the next greatest thing, and obviously wanting to keep their business. And it's just, there's a lot going on with tennis.
Yeah, a ton going on. It's never bored. Curious about your experiences. I know you trained some great players. Like, one that comes to mind is Fanny Stolar, probably butchering the pronunciation, but like, what was that experience like? Like, what did you learn from working with the top pros as well?
Yeah, Fanny is an awesome girl. She's still a good friend of mine, and the backstory behind that was I was living in Dubai at the time, and I made a decision. I told you at the very beginning, like, how I never wanted to work behind a desk, but I basically left IMG to go work behind a desk in Dubai. Didn't like it. Fanny called me and she was like, "Hey, would you be willing to come to train me for preseason in Melbourne?" And, long story short, I quit my job in Dubai. 24 hours later, I'm in the air flying to Melbourne, and I spent 8 weeks with her there. And it was an incredible experience. It was really cool being able to work with her team of coaches, and that was my first experience kind of being with a player and two coaches and just being centered with that. It was my first experience really having one player to focus on. And I think the biggest thing that I learned from my time on the tour is that every city is different and every situation is different, and just a need for adaptability. And I'm such a regimented and routine oriented person. And it was tough to kind of get out of that, but I'm so glad that I did. But yeah, the tour life with Fanny and Varvara was wild, and it was an incredible experience.
Yeah, I saw some with Varvara Lipchenko as well. So, curious too. You mentioned that she called you up. What was, how did you meet her through IMG? Like, how did you know her, and how did that come about?
Yeah, so we met at IMG. So this is right after I took the head tennis job. I started working with like my first kind of group or cohort of like young pros in their transition year. So it was really cool. It was Fanny Stolar, Jacqueline Christian, Michael Moe, and Miomir Kasmanovic. And just awesome people. Again, great players, but just better people. Also unique. And I'm very, very lucky to be able to still maintain a relationship with all of them.
Yeah, 100%, man. That's so cool that you had that experience. Wondering, as far as like just training overall, are there any mistakes that come to mind that you've seen, whether it's amateur or pro or juniors or whatever, like just training mistakes that you found that are very common, that maybe we could just kind of enrich the knowledge of the people listening so that they don't make the same mistakes?
Yeah, it goes back to just the what I've been saying throughout this talk is I think people make things more complex than they need to more complex than they need to. Again, focus on the basics. Move well first before we start to do and incorporate varying pieces of equipment and varying degrees of complexity. That's what I would say.
Gotcha. And so again, I know it's like that things vary. It depends on the person, but is there any sort of timeline or some philosophy around like how frequently should you change like a workout? Let's say you have your speed day. Like, do you do that particular speed workout for 4 weeks in a row and then you switch it, or like how does that work?
Yeah, so typically I'll create my programs for 3 to 4 weeks at a time.
Okay.
And progress from there. But again, it depends on what the calendar looks like, and it depends on, with tennis players, what the schedule looks like, and what the tournaments are happening at a given time. And so much about tennis is just being adaptable. And again, you can have the perfect plan created, but it's that phrase like all plans, all plans are great, but no plans ever go according to plan, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important to be adaptable in that respect. And and ultimately, not progress until the athletes are ready to, and still until they demonstrate competency in whatever skills we're working on at a given time.
Got it, Justin. As far as Olympic lifts, because I have been, a complete idiot, and I've done it like in the wrong form and like injured myself before. But at what point do you introduce that Olympic lifts, if you do, and is that just for a very elite subsection of tennis players?
Yeah, so Olympic lifting, and talking about Olympic lifting for tennis is something that kind of gets me fired up as well. And I posted something on my story a little while ago about it was a repost, and a coach had basically said, "Hey, look, nothing against Olympic lifting, but you can probably develop the same benefits in terms of power and explosiveness by doing something like a loaded jump, which has a much smaller learning curve." And I very much operate underneath that philosophy as well. Now, with that said, I'm a huge fan of the Olympic lifts. I love the clean, I love the snatch, and I think that they're tremendously beneficial for all athletes, including tennis players. Awesome. The problem that I see with college athletes is that I don't believe that enough athletes are able to perform Olympic movements with the technical proficiency at the speed required to produce the necessary benefits to justify always programming Olympic lifts. So I prefer to stick with something that's simpler and has a smaller learning curve, like a trap bar jump, that still involves a tremendous amount of force production and triple extension, but it's so much simpler to learn. And especially now, coming back and having 10 weeks before the athletes go home for break again, I need to make sure that I'm really maximizing my time with them. But again, the flip side of the coin is, if I have an athlete that is very, very technically proficient in Olympic lifts and can perform these movements proficiently and at the speed they require, why not?
Yeah, makes total sense. Got to be at that level to do it. I was wondering, like, when we look at the juniors you've trained versus the pros and the college players, like, is there like a common difference like in the training programs? Like, I was wondering, like, what traits or like what aspects of the programs are different for the different levels?
I'll relate this back to the question that you asked before about IMG and about how I individualize the programs there. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I think when I'm working with younger athletes, so if I have a high school aged athlete, the program is pretty generalized. If I'm working with middle school and younger athletes than that, again, you look at it and you see such a early specialization sport, and you see these kids that are only playing tennis. So in a way, when I'm working with like younger athletes, I am almost doubling like as a physical education teacher and trying to create environments to help them just develop certain motor skills and motor patterns that they're not being exposed to in the sport of tennis. Now, I think when the level increases, the program becomes much more individualized, but the dialogue becomes a conversation. And it's more of like, okay, how are you feeling on this given day and on this given week? And how can we adjust the program and still stay within the constraints of the philosophy and still attack the goal, but put this athlete in the best position to be successful in doing that. And I think the degree of autonomy increases, the degree of complexity increases along with the level, because they possess that professionalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense, Justin. All right, Justin. So let's go to a couple audience member questions. So we've got a good one from Matt M, who asks, let's say you do help a player improve their physical tools. How much mental training is also needed to help them tap into these increased abilities?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So thanks Matt for asking that. I think to answer that, I try not to look at physical and mental as black and white, and it's mutually exclusive of one another. And I think that mental skills come as a product of the process that is required to develop physical capacities. And I sat down a while ago to develop a presentation that kind of outlined my training philosophy. And I look at myself as somebody that develops physical capabilities and physical qualities that have a carryover to court movements and court skill, and obviously improve performance and prevent injuries. But at the same time, I want to develop the athlete as a person and develop mental skills as well. And when I look at some of the pillars and some of the qualities that I want my athletes to develop from a character standpoint, it's integrity, honesty, work ethic, accountability, independence and autonomy, tenacity, attitude, mental toughness. And I think that all of those things, just to name a few, are things that come as a result of the process of working with someone like myself, and at least I hope so.
Cool. Awesome. Appreciate that answer. Got another one from Charlie W, who asks, what different levels of physical training are used for age groups 12 and under, 14 and under, 16 plus?
Yeah, so I think I touched on thanks. First of all, thank you, Charlie, for asking that question. And I think this is pretty similar to what you and I discussed before. I think looking at somebody that's like 12 and under, or even 14 and under, we work in a sport that is very primarily early specialized, and very dealing with athletes that play tennis as their primary sport and only their primary sport. So dealing with athletes 14 and younger, I almost look at myself as a PE teacher, and how can I create environments there where they can develop motor skills that aren't found in tennis, and essentially recreate game-based play that a lot of kids nowadays aren't getting involved in due to the digital age and what have you. And how can I get them involved in creative environments where they can develop different motor skills that aren't present in their primary sport? And in our case, it's tennis. And then obviously as the age increases, hopefully the training age increases as well, and complexity can increase along with that.
Sweet. Awesome, Justin. And one other one from Heidi S, who asks, what are a few simple things that you can add into your gym or running workout to see and feel a noticeable difference in your speed and agility?
Oh, that's an interesting one. So thanks, Heidi, for asking that. So first of all, I want to precede this by saying that speed and agility development is developed over time, and nothing is ever going to be accomplished overnight. So there are no quick fixes if you are going to want something done right. But as a broad stroke answer, I love the phrase, in order to train fast, or in order to get fast, you have to train fast. And if you're expecting to get faster by running long distances, running miles, and running 300s, it's probably not going to happen. So I would recommend starting by incorporating some types of sprint training into your existing program. And again, the same concept holds true in the weight room. If everything is always done slow and controlled, and there's no explosive dynamic expression of force, you're probably not going to see that type of carryover to speed.
Sweet, Justin. Awesome. Appreciate that answer. So, yeah, I mean, it's been an awesome interview. I really appreciate it, and I obviously want people to know where they can reach you and follow what you're doing. So, where would you recommend that people go to check what you're doing, and get updated with what you're doing, and also the athletes that you're training, what they're doing?
Yeah, I think my Instagram's the best place to probably do that. I go on Instagram probably more than I should, but the Instagram is at Coach Justin Russ, and that's where I'm going to be posting a lot more content as far as what I'm doing with my athletes now that they're back. I post stories regularly, and that's the easiest way to get in touch with me. That's, I think, how you reached out initially. So feel free to slide into the DMs if you have questions and comments, and I would love to hear some of your feedback on this as well. So Instagram at Coach Justin Russ.
Sweet, Justin. Appreciate that. And before I let you go, I'll just ask you this one question that I always ask people or guests, which is, what is one key tip that you can give us to help us improve our tennis fitness in your case?
Oh man, that might be the hardest question that if only one.
Yeah.
So one tip to improve your tennis fitness: master the basics. And when we start to incorporate on court movements, learn body control and deceleration before getting complex.
Got it. Got it. Good stuff, Justin. Well, I appreciate it, man. It was a lot of fun, and I really particularly enjoy talking and discussing, fitness-related topics with experts like yourself. And I just want to applaud you for all the great work you're doing. And I'm sure it's really exciting to have your athletes, back with you and training and everything. So I just want to wish you and the Who's the best of luck moving forward. And I'm sure I'll be connecting with you again in the future. So thanks a lot for coming on to the podcast, and appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be, like I said at the beginning, just to be considered amongst the people that you've sat down with, and I know you've used the expert adjective, and it's one of those where you always try to constantly improve and constantly learn. So that's what I'm trying to do. And it's always, how can I make myself better to provide a better service for my athletes and put them in better positions to perform on court. So thank you so much for your time, and the questions that you've asked were awesome, and the audience questions were great. So it's been a lot of fun having this discussion with you. So hopefully we can continue to stay connected and continue to talk.
100%, Justin. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it. And talk to you again very soon.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.